In the early spring of 1944, a farmer named Thomas Henrikson stood at the edge of his property in southern Illinois, looking out over 340 acres of rich, dark soil that had been in his family for 3 generations. The land rolled gently toward a small creek that divided his property from the neighboring farms, and on clear mornings like this one in March, he could see all the way to the tree line that marked the eastern boundary. Thomas was 52 years old that year, with hands roughened by decades of work and a face weathered by sun and wind. His 2 sons were overseas, one in the Pacific and one preparing for what everyone knew would be the invasion of France. And every morning when he walked his fields, he thought of them. The war had changed everything about farming. The government had put out calls for increased production, and farmers across America were planting every available acre to feed not just the nation, but the Allied forces fighting across Europe and the Pacific. Thomas had always grown corn on his land, as his father had before him, and his father before that. The soil was perfect for it, the climate ideal, and he knew every inch of those fields like he knew the lines on his own palms. But this year felt different. This year carried a weight that previous seasons had never held. In late March, Thomas received a visit from a man named Robert Hutchins, who worked for the United States Department of Agriculture. Robert arrived in a dust-covered Ford, parking it near the barn where Thomas was repairing a piece of equipment. Robert was younger, perhaps in his mid-30s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and carrying a leather briefcase that looked out of place in the rural setting. He introduced himself and asked if they could talk somewhere private. Thomas led him into the farmhouse kitchen, where his wife Margaret set out coffee and then excused herself, sensing this was official business.
Robert explained that the government was coordinating a special program. The military needed massive quantities of corn, but not for the usual purposes. They were developing a new process to extract industrial alcohol from corn at an unprecedented scale. And this alcohol was essential for manufacturing synthetic rubber. With Japanese forces controlling most of the rubber-producing regions in Southeast Asia, the United States had been cut off from natural rubber supplies. Every tire on every Jeep, every truck, every aircraft needed rubber. The invasion everyone anticipated would require thousands upon thousands of vehicles, and without rubber, those vehicles couldn't move. The synthetic rubber program had become one of the most critical elements of the war effort, though few civilians know about it. Robert told Thomas that his farm had been identified as ideal for a trial program. The soil composition, the climate data from previous years, and Thomas's reputation as an exceptional farmer all made his land perfect for growing a specialized hybrid corn variety that yielded higher quantities of the starches needed for alcohol production. The government wanted Thomas to dedicate his entire acreage to this special corn. They would provide the seeds, technical support, and guaranteed purchase of the entire harvest at premium prices. But there was a catch. The corn had to be planted earlier than usual, tended with extraordinary care, and harvested under strict timing guidelines. Any deviation could compromise the quality needed for the alcohol extraction process. And everything about the program was classified. Thomas couldn't tell anyone, not even his wife, about the true purpose of his crop.
Thomas sat in silence for a long moment after Robert finished explaining. He thought about his sons. He thought about the newsreels he'd seen at the town cinema, showing the devastation in Europe, the fighting in the Pacific. He thought about his neighbors who had also sent sons and daughters to war, about the gold stars already appearing in some windows in town, signifying families who would never see their children come home. Then he looked at Robert and said he would do it. Whatever the government needed, he would make it happen. The seeds arrived in early April, delivered in unmarked trucks that came before dawn. Thomas had never seen corn seeds quite like these. They were larger than the varieties he usually planted, with a slightly different coloration. Robert returned with an agricultural specialist named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been working on hybrid development at a university laboratory before being recruited into war work. Dr. Chen was meticulous and intense, and she spent 3 days walking every acre of Thomas's land, taking soil samples, measuring elevation changes, and making notes in a thick journal she carried everywhere. She explained to Thomas that this hybrid had been developed specifically for rapid starch production, but it was also temperamental. It needed precise amounts of water, specific soil temperatures for germination, and careful protection from pests that would normally be minor nuisances but could devastate this particular variety.
Thomas began planting on April 15th, earlier than he had ever planted corn in his life. The soil temperature was barely adequate, but Dr. Chen had calculated that they needed the extra growing time. Thomas worked 18-hour days, operating his tractor by lamplight in the early mornings and late evenings. His wife Margaret helped where she could, bringing meals out to the field, maintaining the equipment, handling the endless small tasks that kept a farm running. She asked questions at first, confused about why everything was different this year, why strangers were visiting the farm, why Thomas seemed so driven. He hated lying to her, but he simply said it was a government contract and left it at that. She was intelligent enough to read between the lines, understanding that in wartime some things couldn't be discussed, and she stopped asking. The corn sprouted within 10 days, emerging from the dark soil in neat rows that stretched across all 340 acres. Thomas had never seen such uniform germination. Whatever the scientists had done to develop this hybrid, it was remarkable. By early May, the field was a carpet of vibrant green, the young corn plants growing at a rate that seemed almost unnatural. Dr. Chen visited twice a week, always checking measurements, always taking samples. She brought technical bulletins for Thomas to read, explaining in dense scientific language what made this corn special. Thomas understood perhaps half of what he read, but he understood enough. The key was in the starch structure of the kernels, which could be broken down more efficiently into the sugars needed for fermentation, which then produced the alcohol required for synthetic rubber production. But by mid-May, problems emerged. A pest called corn flea beetles appeared in numbers Thomas had never encountered before. These tiny black insects, barely visible to the naked eye, began attacking the young plants, chewing on leaves and potentially spreading a disease called Stewart's wilt. In a normal year, Thomas might have tolerated some damage, knowing the corn would outgrow the pest pressure. But Dr. Chen was adamant that they couldn't risk any reduction in the crop's vigor. She arranged for emergency shipments of pesticides, and Thomas spent a week spraying his fields morning and evening. The chemicals worked, but they were harsh and expensive, and using them felt wrong to a farmer who had always tried to work with nature rather than against it. Still, he reminded himself why he was doing this, and he continued.
June brought a drought. The Weather Service had predicted normal rainfall, but by the 3rd week of the month, Thomas's fields had received less than half an inch of rain. The corn, now knee-high and entering a critical growth phase, began showing stress. The leaves started curling at the edges, and the deep green color faded slightly. Thomas had irrigation equipment, but not enough to water 340 acres adequately. He called Robert, who called someone else, who called someone else, and within 48 hours, a convoy of military trucks arrived, carrying portable irrigation systems. Soldiers in work uniforms spent 2 days helping Thomas install pumps and lay pipes throughout the fields. None of them asked what the corn was for. They simply did their jobs with quiet efficiency, and Thomas felt a profound gratitude for these young men, some barely older than his own sons, working in the hot June sun to save his crop. The irrigation saved the corn. By early July, the plants were chest-high and healthy, their deep green color restored. The tassels began to appear, those delicate structures at the top of each plant that would produce the pollen needed for fertilization. Thomas walked his fields every day, sometimes multiple times a day, checking for any signs of trouble. He found himself talking to the corn, which he had never done before, encouraging it, urging it to grow strong. Margaret caught him doing this once and smiled, but she didn't tease him. She understood that something important was happening, even if she didn't know exactly what. The corn pollinated beautifully in mid-July. The tassels released their pollen, which drifted down onto the silks emerging from the developing ears. Each silk connected to a potential kernel, and successful pollination would determine the final yield. Thomas had grown corn his entire life, but he had never watched the pollination process with such intense focus. Dr. Chen visited during this period and seemed satisfied, even allowing herself a small smile as she examined the silks under a magnifying glass. August brought the final growth phase. The kernels developed rapidly, transitioning from watery blisters to firm structures packed with starch. Thomas could track the progress by feeling the ears, and he spent countless hours moving through the rows, checking random plants throughout the field. The military's portable irrigation system continued to operate, ensuring the corn had adequate moisture during this critical period. The electric dills from running the pumps were astronomical, but Robert had assured Thomas the government would cover all expenses.
By late August, the corn was nearly mature. The stalks stood well over 7 feet tall, and the ears were thick and heavy. Dr. Chen took samples and had them analyzed at a laboratory. She reported that the starch content was exceeding projections. If the entire field performed similarly, they would produce enough corn to manufacture rubber for nearly 8,000 vehicle tires. Thomas had trouble comprehending that number. 8,000 tires. He tried to imagine 8,000 trucks or jeeps, all rolling through France or Italy or the Pacific Islands, all dependent in some small way on these 340 acres in southern Illinois. But the harvest timing was critical. If they harvested too early, the kernels wouldn't have reached peak starch content. Too late, and the corn would begin drying down too much, making the extraction process less efficient. Dr. Chen calculated that they had a window of approximately 5 days in early September when the harvest needed to occur. She arranged for specialized equipment and crews to ensure they could harvest the entire field within that time frame. September 5th arrived, and with it came a sudden cold front. Temperatures dropped 20 degrees overnight, and a fierce wind bent the corn stalks at alarming angles. Thomas was awake before dawn, standing in his field in the darkness, listening to the stalks creak and groan under the wind's force.
He was terrified that the crop would lodge, meaning the stalks would break or fall over, making harvest nearly impossible. As the sun rose, he could see patches where the corn had indeed fallen. His heart sank. All those months of work, all that care and effort, potentially ruined by a single night of wind. Robert arrived by mid-morning with Dr. Chen and a team of assessors. They walked the fields carefully, calculating damage. It was bad but not catastrophic. Perhaps 15% of the field had lodged significantly. The rest was bent but still standing. Dr. Chen made a decision. They would begin harvest immediately, starting with the worst damaged sections while the corn could still be recovered. She had already arranged for the specialized equipment and crews, but now everything had to happen faster than planned.
By noon, 3 massive combines entered Thomas's fields, machines painted olive drab and operated by soldiers trained in agricultural work. Behind them came a fleet of trucks to haul the harvested corn. Thomas climbed into the cab of his own smaller combine and joined the effort. They worked through the day and into the night, the fields illuminated by powerful spotlights mounted on military vehicles. The noise was tremendous, the combines rumbling and clattering as they devoured the corn rows, the trucks coming and going in constant rotation. Thomas worked for 26 hours straight, stopping only to refuel his machine and grab food that Margaret brought out to the field. He was exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, his vision blurring with fatigue, but he kept going. The soldiers operating the military combines worked in shifts, fresh crews replacing tired ones. But Thomas refused to stop. These were his fields, his corn, and he would see it through to the end. By the morning of September 7th, they had harvested 90% of the field. The remaining 10% was the corn that had lodged worst, and it required special handling. Thomas and a crew of soldiers worked with modified equipment, moving slowly through the tangled stalks, recovering what they could. Some corn was lost, inevitably, but by the evening of September 8th, the harvest was essentially complete. 340 acres of specialized hybrid corn, reduced to mountains of grain piled in storage facilities that had been hastily erected at the edge of Thomas's property. Dr. Chen conducted final tests and announced that the harvest had exceeded expectations despite the weather challenges. The corn would produce enough industrial alcohol for manufacturing rubber for approximately 7,800 tires. Thomas learned later that the alcohol would also be used in other applications: plastics for aircraft components, medical supplies, even explosives. His 340 acres would contribute to the war effort in ways he couldn't fully trace or understand.
The corn was loaded onto railroad cars over the next week and shipped to processing facilities in the Midwest, where it would be converted to alcohol in massive industrial operations. Thomas received his payment from the government, a sum larger than he had ever earned from a harvest, though money had never been his motivation. He paid off the mortgage on his farm and put the rest away, thinking he might use it to help his sons start their own farms when they came home. If they came home. In October, Thomas received a letter from Robert thanking him for his service to the war effort. The letter was formal and official, but there was a handwritten note at the bottom. Robert wrote that the rubber produced from Thomas's corn and from other farms in the program was already being used in vehicles that were stockpiling in England, preparing for operations in Europe. He couldn't say more, but he wanted Thomas to know that his work mattered, that it was making a difference. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer in his desk. He didn't show it to Margaret, though he wanted to. He stood at his kitchen window, looking out over his fields, now empty except for the stubble of harvested corn, and he thought about supply lines and logistics, about all the invisible connections that make a war effort possible. He thought about how a farm in Illinois could be linked to a beach in France or an island in the Pacific, how everything was connected in ways people rarely considered. November brought news that Thomas's younger son Daniel had been wounded in Italy. He was alive, but in a field hospital, and he would be coming home. Thomas and Margaret wept together when they got the telegram, relief overwhelming them despite the news of injury. A week later, they learned that their older son, James, was safe and would be part of the forces preparing for future operations. The censors had cut out any details, but he was alive, and that was everything. December arrived, and with it came the first snows. Thomas spent his days maintaining equipment and planning for the next season. Robert visited one final time before Christmas, bringing news that the synthetic rubber program had been an enormous success. American factories were now producing rubber at rates that exceeded peacetime production of natural rubber, and the material was going into everything the military needed. The crisis that had threatened to cripple the war effort had been solved through agricultural chemistry and the work of farmers like Thomas. Robert also told him something that was still classified, but that he felt Thomas deserved to know. The military was planning a massive operation in France, an invasion that would begin the liberation of Western Europe. The operation would require the largest assembly of vehicles, ships, and aircraft ever attempted. Every one of those vehicles would roll on tires made possible, in part, by corn from farms across America. Thomas's 340 acres would be multiplied by thousands of other farms, all contributing to this vast undertaking. Thomas thanked Robert, but he found himself unable to speak much beyond that. The weight of it all was too much to put into words. After Robert left, Thomas walked out into his snow-covered fields alone. He stood in the December cold, his breath forming clouds in the air, and he thought about the spring planting coming in a few months, about the regular corn he would grow, about the possibility that his sons might be home to help with the next harvest.
In the spring of 1945, Thomas planted his fields with regular corn varieties. The war was clearly moving toward its conclusion, though battles still raged and men were still dying. His son Daniel came home in March, his leg damaged but healing. He helped with the planting, moving slowly but determined to be useful. They worked together in the fields, father and son, not talking much but comfortable in the shared labor. In May, they received word that the war in Europe had ended. The invasion Robert had mentioned, the great operation that became known as D-Day, had succeeded, and Allied forces had pushed through France and Germany to final victory. Thomas and Daniel stood in their fields when they heard the news, and Thomas thought about rubber and tires and supply lines, about 340 acres of specialized corn, about all the things that had to go right for such an enormous undertaking to succeed. James came home in September, after the war in the Pacific ended. He was different, quieter, and he had nightmares sometimes, but he was alive. The three of them, Thomas and his two sons, harvested the regular corn crop together that fall. It was a good harvest, not extraordinary, just solid and reliable like farms were supposed to be. Thomas found himself grateful for the ordinary nature of it, for the simple rhythm of planting and growing and harvesting, without the pressure of knowing that thousands of lives might depend on the success of his fields. Years later, after the war had become history, and the soldiers had become veterans, and the urgent industrial mobilization had given way to peacetime prosperity,
Thomas sometimes stood at the edge of his fields and remembered that spring of 1944. He remembered the specialized seeds and the careful planting, the pest battles and the drought, the wind damage and the frantic harvest under spotlights. He remembered Dr. Chen with her intensity and her journals, Robert with his briefcase and his formal letters, the soldiers who had helped install irrigation systems and operate combines.
He never told anyone the full story. Margaret knew pieces of it, guessed others, but he had kept the classified details to himself. His sons knew only that during the war, their father had grown some kind of special corn for the government. The town knew nothing at all. Thomas preferred it that way. The work hadn't been about recognition or fame. It had been about doing what needed to be done when the need was greatest. Sometimes Thomas would calculate the numbers in his head. 7,800 tires, give or take. If those tires lasted for, say, 10,000 miles each, that was 78 million miles of travel, contributed by 340 acres in southern Illinois. How many supply runs did that represent? How many evacuations of wounded soldiers? How many advances through enemy territory? The numbers were too large to comprehend, the connections too complex to fully trace. But somewhere in France or Germany or the Pacific Islands, his corn had been there, transformed into rubber, transformed into tires, transformed into motion and supply and support. He thought about all the other farmers who must have participated in similar programs, growing specialized crops, or raising specific livestock, or dedicating their land to the war effort in ways they could never discuss. How many secret programs had there been? How many quiet contributions from ordinary people doing extraordinary things because their country needed them? The history books would tell the stories of battles and generals, of great decisions and turning points, but they would never fully capture the vast network of support that made all of it possible.
Thomas Henrikson died in 1967 at the age of 75. His sons inherited the farm and continued working the land. They found the letter from Robert in their father's desk, along with some technical bulletins about hybrid corn varieties and a small newspaper clipping about synthetic rubber production during the war. They pieced together some of what their father had done, though many details remained mysterious. They framed the letter and hung it in the farmhouse, a small memorial to their father's contribution to the war, to that spring and summer and fall of 1944, when 340 acres of corn in southern Illinois became part of something much larger than any of them could have imagined. The land continues to produce corn today, worked by Thomas's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It's productive soil, rich and dark, the same land that has grown corn for more than a century. Sometimes the family tells the story of how their grandfather helped the war effort by growing special corn, though the details have faded with time and the loss of those who were there. It's become a family legend, something between history and myth, the way all old stories eventually do. But the essential truth remains. In 1944, one farmer with 340 acres answered his country's call in the way he knew best, by coaxing life from the soil, by applying his skill and experience and dedication to the ancient art of growing corn. And that corn, transformed by science and industry into materials that seemed far removed from a farm in Illinois, helped thousands of American soldiers do their jobs, fight their battles, and many of them come home.